Hello, welcome to my channel where I turn my very expensive linguistics degree into free YouTube content. What a smart financial move. Anyway, have you ever seen one of those lists online? You know, they usually have a title like 10 words English can't translate or the most beautiful untranslatable words in the world. They almost always include the usual suspects. Schadenfreude in German, that guilty pleasure when your rival fails. And sorry for the pronunciation, I do not speak German. Komorebi in Japanese, the sunlight filtering softly through leaves. And of course, saudade in Portuguese, a deep nostalgic longing for something that's missing. These lists go viral because they make us feel like there are secret concepts locked inside other languages, things English can't even touch. Which is ironic because English has never met a foreign word it did not immediately adopt and mispronounce. But here's the thing about untranslatable words. Linguists would say that's a myth. Nothing is truly untranslatable. The problem is just that translation doesn't always give you a one-word answer. Sometimes it takes a phrase, a sentence, or even a little story to translate something. And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We'll talk about why untranslatable words aren't as mysterious as they sound, how languages carve up meaning differently, and how translators make it all work. Somehow, against all odds, and usually for very little money. Part 1. The myth of the untranslatable word. Let's start with the word itself, untranslatable. It's clickbaity, it's dramatic, it makes you feel like other languages are hiding magical concepts that English just isn't smart enough to handle. But is anything ever truly untranslatable? Back in 1959, the linguist Roman Jakobson wrote an important essay called On Linguistic Aspects of Translation. In it, he argued that translation is never about perfect sameness. Instead, it's about what he called equivalence in difference. Here's what that means in plain English. Every language chops up the world differently. And when you translate, you can't always keep the exact same form, but you can still keep the meaning. Take German schadenfreude. If I translate it literally, it's harm, joy, which is not very elegant. But if I translate it descriptively, it's the pleasure you feel when someone else suffers. A little longer, for sure, but you get it immediately. So is it untranslatable? No, it just takes more words. Jakobson would say you've created equivalence through difference. And this is where the myth creeps in, because when translation isn't a neat one-to-one swap, it feels like a gap. But it's not a gap in understanding, it's a gap in packaging. Which brings us to our second part, how do languages package meaning? Well, think of every language as a giant set of Tupperware boxes. And don't worry, I promise you this analogy doesn't end with a sales pitch. Anyway, so these Tupperware boxes are your vocabulary. Some languages have small, precise boxes for certain ideas, while others have big general boxes. And sometimes, when you try to fit an idea from one language into another, it just doesn't snap shut. Here are some great examples I've already mentioned. In Japanese, you have komorebi, literally tree, leak, sun, and it means the sunlight filtering softly through leaves. While English doesn't have a neat box for this, it can still describe it easily. I literally just did. English has the word awkward. Try explaining that to someone in another language. Am I right? In French, you might say something like gênant or maladroit, but neither fully captures that mix of clumsiness and social discomfort. English just has its own neat box for it. And fun fact, we often use the word awkward in French. Inuktitut, and don't ask me to pronounce it, I do not know, is a language spoken in the Arctic, and it has words for different types of snow. Not 100 as the myth goes, but enough to cover textures and uses. English just kind of lumps it all together into one big box and says snow. And if you want to be specific, we have to describe it. Wet snow, powdery snow, icy snow, etc., etc. So when people say a word is untranslatable, what they really mean is my language doesn't have that same box. But the concept itself isn't unreachable, you just describe it differently. Which is why translators hate two things: poetry and Netflix character limits. This connects to a famous debate in linguistics called linguistic relativity, also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The strong version, the one you sometimes see online, says if your language doesn't have a word for something, you can't think it. And this statement isn't really supported by evidence. The weaker version, which is much more accepted, says the words your language gives you make some ideas more natural or more salient. So, when Japanese speakers say komorebi, the word highlights that experience in a way English doesn't. But, and you will probably agree, it doesn't mean that English speakers can't see sunlight through leaves. They just don't have a pre-packaged label for it. And that brings us to our third part, which is, why do these words exist in one language but not another? And the answer is basically culture. Every word is a reflection of what a community finds important enough to name. Take the Portuguese word saudade. It's much more than just missing someone or something. It carries nostalgia, absence, even sweetness in the sadness. Some historians argue it connects to Portugal's history of migration and seafaring, where families would be separated for years waiting for someone to return. That cultural experience carved out a word. Another example is the Japanese word tsundoku, which is essentially buying books and letting them pile up without reading them. Sure, English speakers know the feeling, but Japanese speakers named it. Why, you might ask? Well, because books, knowledge, and study have cultural significance in Japan. In 2018, a paper by Brockmeyer and colleagues in Theory and Psychology described these words as experiential maps. They argued that so-called untranslatable words are valuable because they highlight what different cultures pay attention to. In other words, it's not that we can't translate them, it's more that they point us towards values and experiences that are more central in one culture than another. And that brings us to our final part, part 4, how translators do it. Okay, theory aside, what do translators do when they run into untranslatable words? Do they panic? Do they give up? No, they just get creative. One famous translation scholar, Eugene Nida, made a distinction between formal equivalence and dynamic equivalence. While formal equivalence tries to keep the original structure as close as possible, dynamic equivalence tries to capture the same effect on the reader even if the words change. So, with schadenfreude, a formal translation might be harm joy. Accurate, but clunky. A dynamic translation might be that guilty pleasure when someone else fails. Longer, but clearer. Another influential approach is the interpretive theory of translation developed by Danica Selskovic. I really hope I'm not butchering the name. She argued that translators first understand the sense of a word, strip away the exact phrasing, and then rebuild it in the target language. It's kind of like undressing an idea and then dressing it again in new clothes. Essentially translation, but make it drag. Modern research actually backs this up. A 2019 paper on translation strategies found that human translators frequently use paraphrase, modulation, and cultural adaptation to handle tricky phrases. In other words, they always find a way. So the next time someone says a word is untranslatable, remember, translators deal with these every day, and they do just fine, arguably. So, untranslatable words? Nah, just words that make translators earn their paycheck. But they do remind us how differently people wrap meaning. And that's the fun part. So next time you see a list of untranslatable words, don't think of them as locked secrets. Think of them as invitations to see the world through someone else's eyes. And now, I want to hear from you. What's your favorite so-called untranslatable word? Drop it in the comments, especially if it's from your own language. As usual, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'm sure this one will not get lost in translation. Whoa, I'm getting creative with those outros.